What you have is people test an idea in the petri dish, but that doesn't really change the world. What you really need is you need that idea to go outside of the petri dish. In many cases, roughly 4 out of 5 times, something that looks great in the petri dish fails in the large. It's really important from the very beginning to think about, does the idea work in the small, but also does it have a chance to work in the large? So for example, I started a preschool in Chicago Heights. And that preschool, of course, I could hire 30 great teachers, but that's not really a test of scale. That's a test of whether I could hire 30 great teachers and have the preschool work. So that means from the very beginning, I want to hire excellent teachers, kind of some mediocre teachers, but also some not so good teachers. And then I want to see, does my idea have voltage? That's an idea that from the very beginning I'm testing. Is it a good idea? But also, can it scale with the kinds of teachers I will have to hire at scale? There's an airline called Virgin Atlantic Airways, and they called me one day and said, we're having problems. We think we're spending too much on gasoline, on fuel, and we think we're emitting too much CO2 emissions. I looked at first the fuel. Most jets actually put way too much fuel on the plane. Now that ends up being a problem because then the plane is heavier. To fly a heavier object, you have to burn more jet fuel, and then of course that emits more CO2 emissions. So rule number 1 is don't put so much jet fuel on the plane. Rule number 2 is a lot of the pilots were taking inefficient routes. And then finally, when the pilot lands the plane, there's a fundamental mistake that nearly every pilot makes, and that's you should cut all engines but one. So what we did is we noticed those 3 things, and then we went in and we ran experiments with all of the pilots at Virgin Atlantic Airways. We gave them incentives to have less fuel or incentives to cut all the engines but one. And what we found is over roughly an 8 to 9 month period, we saved nearly 25,000 tons of CO2 emissions, and we saved them tens of millions of dollars in jet fuel. That's something where simple economics, simple behavioral economics, and simple field experiments can really help change the world for the better. To really explore discrimination amongst police or whomever, you need to know not only the crimes that were committed that were caught, but also the ones that were committed that the person never got caught. At the time, I was the chief economist at Lyft, so I went into our data, which happens to have GPS data for every driver over every patch of land and every minute if the driver is speeding or not. I filed what's called a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act, and only one state responded, Florida. I have the exact same car at the exact same period of time going, say, 15 miles an hour over, that's driven by a minority person and one that's driven by a majority person. And what I find is that the level of discrimination is even greater than has been reported. So it's not less, it's actually worse than what popular press has told us it is. And that's an issue there where simple economic thinking can take on a huge social challenge when you combine with some interesting business like Lyft. Policy change is hard because science is uncertain. And anytime you have a policymaker who wants to do right by their community, they want a sure thing. We need to do better to teach the policymakers and the public about the uncertainties of science, because once we do that, science can unlock great human capital and great economic growth. When you look at Youngstown, or more broadly, when you look at Ohio, this is obviously a very proud community. A lot of communities I visit that have been in the manufacturing belt, in what's called the, quote, Rust Belt, they typically have the same sorts of problems. I think it starts with attracting high-quality jobs. So you can say, well, why would a firm want to come here if we don't have a highly educated, skilled job workforce? That's where early childhood comes in. Passing some kind of bill that was early childhood for all, where from the crib to when the child goes to Youngstown State or Ohio State or Cleveland State, wherever they go to college, we have a public system that is there for them and is fair for them. A lot of parents around underserved communities never really have a chance because they can't afford childcare. When my first child came out, what we got was a vaccination schedule from the doctor. And the doctor said, follow this vaccination schedule. And I said, okay, where's the growing the baby's brain schedule? Because I have no idea how to raise a child. And that's the issue. We have the science now to give parents a playbook. When you have that in pocket, now all the firms will want to come here. All the great jobs will want to come here because the brilliant people who are raised in Ohio, guess what? Where you're raised, that tends to be where you want to live. But we need to give everybody a chance. Everybody deserves an equal opportunity to succeed. And that begins with economic incentives. Field experiments matter because I can go to the real world and I can first of all measure cause and effect. Do people discriminate? Are people generous? But I can also measure why do people discriminate? Why are people generous? Why do inner city schools fail? Field experiments not only measure something, but they give you the why behind it. Once you know the why, now we have the solutions.